Welcome back to the final hour of the Hill's America's Vote 2024 election coverage. The polls have closed here in the 11 p.m. hour in California, parts of Idaho, parts of Oregon, and Washington State.
And with that, for the final hour of our coverage this evening, let's bring back in the Hill's editor-in-chief Bob Cusack and national political reporter Julia Manchester. Guys, what an evening this has been. Bob, let's jump right into Pennsylvania because really this is the ball game here. If Kamala Harris can carry it, she still has a shot to victory.
Yeah.
If Trump takes it, I think that the cake is basically baked there. Donald Trump is leading in Pennsylvania in a lot of areas, and I was looking at the numbers from compared to 2020, and here he's running up the numbers in a lot of districts. Adams County up by 12 percentage points from last cycle. Carbon County another 13 percentage points from last cycle. Donald Trump seems to be dominating in the state of Pennsylvania.
Listen, there's not a lot of good news for Harris right now. I mean, there is just no data that you can say, yeah, okay, she's got a lot of hope. I mean, her path has gotten so narrow, and it's amazing. It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
I would have never thought we'd be in this position. And again, pollsters were wrong. They said, oh, we've accounted for Trump again after basically he overperformed in 2016 and 2020. No, they didn't, because he is overperforming yet again.
And I've been looking at some of these exit polls out of states like Pennsylvania, and one thing we didn't necessarily expect, considering sort of the fallout from that Madison Square Garden rally and the comments about Puerto Ricans, there is a notably significant Puerto Rican population in Philadelphia, for example. I don't want to paint the Latino and Hispanic community with a broad brush, but he is doing very well with Latinos and Hispanic voters in areas like Philadelphia, like Allentown. He's not necessarily winning them outright, but she is not doing well enough in order to offset him.
Sure.
Along those same lines, I want to go back to Osceola County in Florida because I think it's really so emblematic of what we're seeing in this election. It's the county in Florida with the biggest Puerto Rican population. In 2016, Clinton won it by 24 points. I just looked, 100% precincts reporting. Trump won the county by 1.5 percentage points. It's just a complete reversal of the Puerto Rican vote, the Hispanic vote in the less than 10 years.
Well, a lot of people have criticized Trump and how he closed, especially over the last couple of weeks. And I thought Harris did have a better close. But at the same time, Trump knows what he's doing. He won in 2016. He narrowly lost in 2020. And it looked like, again, he's on his way to victory. And this is just a disaster. You mentioned those numbers. There's going to be more numbers to pour over, and Democrats have to come up with their own. Remember, Mitt Romney lost in 2012 and they had an autopsy report. Democrats have to pick up the pieces and figure out what went wrong.
Yeah, and Julia, on that note, let's look at Georgia quickly, because Decision Desk HQ has called Georgia for former President Donald Trump, leading right now 51% to 48.2%. Just 4 years ago in 2020, Joe Biden won that state by 0.23 percentage points. That is a massive swing for such a battleground state like Georgia.
And I think we've seen that Donald Trump has been able to flip a number of those independent voters, particularly around the greater Atlanta area, those Atlanta suburbs. I think 2020 was obviously different in many ways, obviously, but I think Brian Kemp in particular, we know that, when Donald Trump lost Georgia, the feud hadn't necessarily erupted yet the way it already has, but I think Kemp has really helped boost Trump in Georgia. But also, I mean, look, I'm interested to see, and I haven't done a deep dive into these numbers out of Georgia, but what does the Democratic base turnout in Georgia look like? What does the black turnout look like? I mean, I think Stacey Abrams played a huge role in galvanizing the black vote in 2020, but there were indicators going into tonight's that showed that they might have been somewhat less enthusiastic than they were in 2020.
Yeah, Bob, you mentioned that autopsy. There's definitely going to be one this cycle. I want to break in, though, quickly. We have some race projections right here. Decision Desk HQ projecting that Kamala Harris has won the state of California. No surprise there. And Donald Trump has won the state of Idaho. So still, Bob, I mean, two race calls. Kamala Harris has a lot of electoral votes, but those aren't the ones that she needed to focus on right now.
No, remember in 2016, after Trump won Pennsylvania, and that was basically it. You know, some Democrats, and we saw this in Saturday Night Live skit back then, saying, well, maybe we can win Alaska. And then it's like, no, Alaska for Trump. So you know some of these states are going to go red. But you know, when politics, as you all know, is about expectations. And the expectation tonight was this is a toss-up. This is a coin flip. It could go either way. I got up today, and I wasn't sure who was going to win. I am stunned what I am seeing. I knew, you know, it could go one way or the other, but it has gone all Trump's way so far. It could change, but I don't see any sign of that.
You know, we talk about what issues were at play here. There was a lot of talk of whether abortion was going to carry the day. I come back to the old adage from Carville is the economy stupid?
Yeah.
And I wonder if hanging over all of this is just a sentiment among the American people that the economy is not good, inflation is too high. All other issues aside, that's really what's the deciding factor on Election Day.
Yeah, look, and you know, talking to Republicans and Republican women, you know, one question I would ask them, look, in 2022, does that trend continue? Do we see a lot of these female voters maybe consider abortion an economic issue in many ways, because we know that the decision to start a family is an economic decision, but a lot of Republicans would say to me, oftentimes in households, women are the prime deciders, or the top deciders of their families, you know, financial decisions, etc. They keep the budget. You see that in the suburbs, for example, and I think you see this playing out here. You know, also, I think Democrats tried very hard to tie Trump to a lot of these state abortion bans, calling them Trump abortion bans. It might work a little bit, but it seems that voters are compartmentalizing those two things and separating them. You know, being able to, and I think Donald Trump walked a very fine line on this issue. I mean, as much as he's been painted as being anti-abortion, you know, he has repeatedly hammered this talking point of this is a states' rights issue. I'm not, you know, and distance himself from it. I think this is the first time we've seen Republicans really find their footing somewhat on this issue. I mean, the ballot measure in Florida, for example, I mean, I was shocked that didn't pass.
And Bob, you know, as we talk about all these things that we're surprised at, these results, you mentioned again the autopsy before, there's going to be a lot of what ifs. Democrats asking what if Joe Biden had stayed in the race? What if Joe Biden had not run for re-election and there was a robust primary and potentially a different nominee? What if Kamala Harris chose Josh Shapiro?
Right.
What is your take on this reflective process that Democrats are probably going to head into? Do you think that there could have been different factors on the ticket that could have made this outcome different?
Well, I think it depends on the final margin.
Sure.
If Trump goes on to win and basically wins 6 or all of the battlegrounds, I don't think that makes much of a difference. But you can certainly say to Harris that she was too cautious. She wasn't talking to the media until her polls dipped. Then she talked to the media, and she never let her guard down. I thought she had a CNN town hall that I thought it was a disaster. She kept dodging questions, easy questions. How are you different than Joe Biden? I mean, that's just 101.
After Joe Biden opened the door for her
Exactly.
to allow her to sort of criticize a little bit as she needed.
Yes. I mean, there were many mistakes that she made and Trump made. Listen, if she were winning, we'd be like talking about his lack of discipline and why he didn't appeal to independents, didn't use Nikki Haley on the campaign trail. But he's looking like the win, and it's a big win. It's a historic win if he does get there. And listen, I think that people are going to be looking at this and also blaming Joe Biden. Why did he stay in the race so long? Maybe he should have just committed to the one term and said, that's it, I'm done.
Right.
You know, Harris had this strategy of trying to appeal to moderate Republicans. She's out on the campaign trail with Liz Cheney. In hindsight, is that a mistake? Should she have leaned more into her progressive roots? And what will be the lesson learned moving forward for Democrats, do you think, if she ends up losing?
I don't know if it was a mistake. I just don't know if it really did anything. Sure. You know, you heard Liz Cheney talking about this idea of secret Harris voters. You even heard Julia Roberts voice an ad saying, well, if your husband's voting for Trump, you don't have to tell him. This is your business, whatever. And there was this increasing narrative about, you know, those secret Harris voters. But I guess my counter to that throughout this cycle has been, well, what about the secret Trump voters, you know? And I think that's sort of the answer to that.
Yeah, and Bob, there's been a lot of conversation this election cycle about the crossroads that the Republican Party is at. Trump won in 2016. Then the Trump MAGA, America First agenda had suffered losses for the Republican Party. If Trump wins tonight, is the Republican Party completely transformed into MAGA?
Oh, I think so, and going forward, it is too. Like, if Trump does win, he is a lame duck, but he's not going to act like a lame duck from day one. That said, the MAGA effect, as Britt Hume recently said this week, the Ronald Reagan Republican Party is dead. Trump has taken over.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Bob Cusack and Julia Manchester. We'll be right back with more of America's Vote 2024.
And welcome back to America's Vote 2024. And back now with us for more insight into tonight's presidential election is the Hill staff writer Niall Stanage and senior editor Jesse Burns. Niall, we're really seeing results start to come in. We've been talking a lot tonight about that blue wall. That blue wall is looking pretty red tonight. Donald Trump leading in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Kamala Harris holding on to that lead in Michigan. I mean, it's not looking good for the Harris campaign.
It's not. It keeps looking worse. I feel like every time we're talking this election night, Michael, it looks worse and worse for Harris all the time. The fact that Trump is now leading in Pennsylvania by a not insignificant number of votes, with what, about half? Is it 50% in? Or
right now, we're at 71% in, with 3.1% lead for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly difficult to see Harris overcoming that lead. Now, her campaign has sent out a memo saying, not so fast, and it'll be the early hours before this race comes into focus. I think it's already in very sharp focus, just not a focus that they like.
That's right.
Jesse, as these results start to come in, what do you think the Harris campaign, how do they mess up in their theory of what this election was about and what it ended up being?
Well, if these results hold, which it is trending in Trump's direction very clearly, I think there is going to be a lot of focus on, she did have a very short runway. That's well understood going into this election. But she did make some very key strategic decisions. She decided to not draw a clear contrast with President Biden. She decided to take the fight to Trump's backyard in Georgia and in North Carolina instead of just camping out in the blue wall states and maybe Nevada. And she also really tried to paint this picture of Trump as, in the final weeks of the campaign, as a fascist going on the attack. Did that resonate with voters who are worried about inflation, gas prices? They're worried about the price of groceries. They're worried about, abortion measures. Yes, she has tapped into something there, I think, very clearly with the gender gap leading among women in some places 10, 20 points. But did she spend too much time focusing on the negatives with Trump instead of focusing on the positives about Harris? I think that's going to be a lot of second guessing among Democrats after tonight.
Yeah, and I want to break in quickly, guys. We have some more Decision Desk HQ projections right now. The Delaware Senate race has been called for Lisa Blunt Rochester. And then we have another projection, the Maryland Senate race. That will go to Angela Alsobrooks. She was, of course, running against Larry Hogan. And, so we're certain as we get more of these results in, the balance of power in Congress is going to really matter here because it looked like, and we knew this before going into tonight, that the Senate would likely be in Republican hands. Looks like right now the White House is going to be controlled by Donald Trump. Democrats are probably thinking right now, we need the House so we can prevent a trifecta in Washington.
Right, absolutely, because, for Democrats who see Donald Trump as a real threat to democracy, the idea that having him at the head of a unified Republican MAGA government is just a catastrophe from their standpoint. Now, the House picture is still a little bit harder to exactly game out because there's, random races hanging out there, but this obviously has not been a good night for Democrats generally, particularly at the presidential level. And just briefly to return to what Jesse was talking about, I wonder will there be more questioning whether Democrats should actually be doing more to win and copper fasten the working class vote. During this campaign, you saw people like Bernie Sanders, admittedly an independent, not even officially part of the party, but making the argument that there should be more talk about the minimum wage, more talk about universal health care, and the failure to do that has allowed, in Sanders' view, Trump to take more working class votes. I think that will be one of the critiques that's offered.
if this holds up and Trump does in fact win the presidency, do you think in 2028 we see a Democrat that leans left, that comes out sounding more like Bernie Sanders, or maybe a Josh Shapiro type that can play to the moderate center? Where does the Democratic Party go from here? And it would seem to me like there's probably going to be a pretty big fight.
Well, there's going to be a huge fight because, as you'll remember, Harris was one of the most liberal senators when she was in the Senate. She ran a very liberal campaign in 2020 when she ran for president. Of course, has tried to become a much more moderate. She didn't run in the primaries for the Democrat cycle this time, so she has only run as a general election candidate. And so there is going to be a lot of debate among Democrats of, the last time they were really successful with Joe Biden, he ran as more of a moderate Democrat. He appealed to the working class voters. You look at somewhere like Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is a huge labor advocate, and he has lost tonight. Three-term Democrat who has lost to Bernie Moreno, who is an upstart Republican businessman. And so, I think there is going to be a lot of questioning among Democrats. Are they spending enough time talking to average voters, average working class voters in not just the Rust Belt, but across the country, because they've now seen a couple of elections that really hinge on this demographic.
Niall, we're starting to get results now in from Arizona as well. Donald Trump opening up with a 0.2% lead against Kamala Harris with 54% of the vote in. Of course, she needs Pennsylvania in order to win this thing. We've gone over that. But this night is just going from bad to worse for Kamala Harris.
Well, it is. And I mean, Arizona is the state among the battlegrounds where Trump has long had the biggest polling advantage. He was up a couple of points in the polls. Now, of course, it's always possible that a certain state bucks the trend.
Sure.
But it would be amazing if Donald Trump had such a good night as he has had and capped it by losing Arizona. It just seems highly improbable that would happen.
What happened to the Democratic ground game that they've been bragging about all these months? You had someone like Elon Musk come in and he can do rocket ships, and apparently he can win elections. The Democrats send tens of thousands of volunteers out to knock on the same door like 50 times, it seems like, and Elon Musk comes in and figures it out. Did we learn something about the importance of a ground game? Is it changed maybe, as we become so connected and technological?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, of course, both sides have had a pretty robust ground game, and looking at places like Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Detroit, those are places that Democrats are going to hold up as kind of their method for turning out votes. But is that enough? Can you just focus on the cities? You have to go outside to get voters where they lie and go after Trump voters. You have to go after these voters outside of the cities, and so for Democrats, I think that's a big question mark. How do they do that? But also looking at the top of the ticket, the messaging from the very top matters. And so, in the final 2 weeks of this campaign, we saw Harris, really hammering Trump as a fascist. That was the messaging. Instead of focusing on what is the message for a Harris administration, what would that look like in that vision? But in terms of the ground game, Republicans, they've got a robust ground game, and we've seen it tonight in places like North Carolina and Georgia, that they didn't just rest on their laurels when it comes to some of these states.
Break in with a quick Decision Desk H2 projection. Vice President Kamala Harris winning the state of Connecticut right there. Again, not a shocking one. Niall, something that the Harris campaign has really leaned in on in these final days of the campaign was trying to court these disaffected Republicans. We saw Liz Cheney being very vocal on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris. A lot of the times they were targeting some of those districts and counties where Nikki Haley did pretty well in the primaries. We're going to have to look at the crosstabs here and see how many of those voters came out. But that was one of their main themes in the closing stretch of this thing. Was that a misplaced idea?
I think it was, and I think it was a particularly misplaced idea in certain states. I thought the idea of taking Liz Cheney to Michigan, for example, was kind of bananas, honestly, given her family name and its association with wars in the Middle East. But more broadly, I think there is now going to be a lot of second guessing about this idea that the Harris campaign had, that you could peel off the Nikki Haley voters and move them into the Democratic column. As you say, we'll look in more granular detail, but that doesn't appear to have been borne out at all.
A lot of reflection and looking through those crosstabs in the next couple days. Jesse Burns, Niall Stanage, thank you guys so much. And we'll be right back with more of America's Vote 2024 in just a few minutes. Stick with us.
Welcome back to America's Vote 2024. Let's get right to News Nation correspondent Rashad Hudson in West Palm Beach, Florida. Rashad, what's the mood like at Trump HQ?
Yeah, this is an enthusiastic crowd here at the West Palm Beach Convention Center. The crowd behind me is starting to fill up, and they're reacting in real time. They're locked into the monitors behind me. They can see the races as they're called, and when they're called in former President Trump's favor, the crowd is going wild. Now, as for former President Trump, he's still at Mar-a-Lago, where he's huddled with close family and friends and campaign advisors as they're watching the numbers closely as they watch them like millions of Americans come in. Now, we are told that Speaker Mike Johnson is headed to Mar-a-Lago to be there to support former President Trump, and at some point, the former president is expected to address this crowd.
And Rashad, about that timing, any idea when exactly we'll see him come out? Because, the map is looking very good for Donald Trump. As you mentioned, Speaker Johnson is heading
exactly when the former president will make his way over here, but he and his team are still looking at these numbers. They're feeling encouraged. The crowd behind me is very confident. They're all just waiting to see what happens.
Do you know anything about who is he with at this point? I heard that Elon Musk is over there, maybe Dana White, UFC CEO. Who's Trump hanging out with, and who's going to be, if things hold up the way they're looking right now, celebrating with him tonight?
We are told that we can expect to see some celebrities who have endorsed former President Trump. Now, those names haven't quite been released just yet.
And Rashad, any other notable folks you can spot in the crowd? Any other members of Congress? I know you mentioned the speaker's headed down there, and some other members of House GOP leadership, which was said would likely happen if he was doing well in the polls, which he is. Any other notable faces from Congress you see in the crowd?
Yeah, most of the people that are here right now in this room, they're campaign workers, they're longtime supporters, and we are seeing a lot of young men here. And the reason I say that is because that's a demographic that the Trump campaign was trying to make inroads with. They were really trying to get young men to come over to their side, get them engaged in the political process, and vote for the Trump-Vance ticket.
All right, thank you, Rashad Hudson. Now, we do have a new DDHQ projection. Oregon goes to Kamala Harris. No surprises there. Let's toss it over to Next Star Nation's live stream host, Chip Brewster, and founder and editor of Pluralist News, Reed Wilson, with the latest from state and local levels.
Hey, good evening, guys. We wanted to take a moment to talk about a couple of things not really being talked about broadly across the nation, because everyone is so focused, of course, on the presidential and even the Senate and the House, and that is specifically this down-ballot race in North Carolina that is setting some history as it happens.
Well, continuing history, let's put it that way. So a big race that we were watching, everybody was watching the governor's race in North Carolina, right? We remember Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson and his, shall we call it, alleged unfortunate online habits of
I like the phrasing. Well done.
Yeah,
there.
okay, thanks.
Yes.
I do my best. And so Josh Stein, the Attorney General there, beat Mark Robinson. He will be the next governor.
Yep.
North Carolina actually has a long history of electing Democratic governors, despite its Republican performance on the presidential and federal level. Down the ballot a little further, Congressman Jeff Jackson, who was redistricted out of his seat, has defeated Congressman Dan Bishop, a Republican, to become North Carolina's next Attorney General. Now, Jeff Jackson is a Democrat. Democrats have held North Carolina's Attorney General's office since 1896. I did not misspeak there. It will have been more than 130 years by the time Jeff Jackson is up for re-election in 2 years since Republicans held that Attorney General's office.
So what is it about that particular office in this state that, for the governorship at least, can go either way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the governorship has actually favored Democrats over the years. There have been very few elected Republicans.
Since 1896. Right?
Not since 1896, but this is a legacy of the post-Civil War South, in which Democrats were one part, were the uniparty in most southern states through, up until effectively the Civil Rights era, and Democrats held majorities in southern state legislatures way up until 2010 in a lot of states. I mean, even in a case like West Virginia. West Virginia, Democrats lost control of the state legislature in the 2010 elections. Today, in the 100-member House of Delegates in West Virginia, 11 members are Democrats. So once a little bit changed, everything did. North Carolina's legislature flipped Republican back in the 2010 elections. But this race, somehow, people just like their Democratic attorney generals. There we go.
Okay, so that's that particular race and the history that it continues to set. Thanks you for correcting my own phrasing. But now I also want to pivot over to a storyline that was involved with the presidential race but is really separated from it, and that would be the number of abortion-related ballot measures, some in support of, some against. So, for instance, like we're going to start with I'm going to actually scroll down because I don't want to start with the top here. I want to start with the dueling ones in Nebraska. Yes, because this is it's not settled here yet, and it's an interesting case. Go ahead, Reed. Explain where we're at.
So in Nebraska, supporters and opponents of abortion rights qualified ballot measures to get on the November ballot that would, in one case, protect abortion rights and codify them in the state.
And that's the top one, the 439.
Correct, Nebraska Measure 439. And the second measure would prohibit abortions past the first trimester. Now, voters are facing a protection of abortion rights or a restriction of abortion rights. At the moment, both of those measures are passing. You can see that the right to abortion is passing with a 53% to 47% margin. The prohibition on abortion rights is passing by a 51% to 49% margin. Now, the good news for abortion rights supporters is that if these margins hold, state law says that in a case of conflicting ballot initiatives, which this clearly is, the measure that gets the most affirmative votes supersedes the other measure, the one that it conflicts with. Right now, the right to an abortion has gotten 283,000 votes. The restriction on abortion, 271,000 votes. So the right to abortion would supersede that restriction on abortion. But, I mean, you and I were talking off air. How many thousands of people just voted for both of these measures?
Well, and you can math it because it should invert, right? So the 283 up top should be 283 down at the bottom. So that would be 22,000 votes that voted for both in either the affirmative or the against. I guess I don't know where the doubling is at this point. But that kind of leads to the question that I was having was, okay, so you're voting for a restriction and for in support of, so there had to be, it's just math, right? There had to be people that voted to both restrict and support at this point.
And now look, ballot measures are confusing, and they're written in some cases to be deliberately confusing. In other cases, state lawmakers put their sort of thumbs on the scale and change the wording. But interesting result right there, right?
So let's quick look at the other ballot measures, because part of the reason that this was a conversation was there was thought that, perhaps these ballot measures would help to bring out votes for Harris. And while we are seeing some states are breaking that way, so let's see, well, Colorado, we know yes went for Harris, and so there's a huge support there. That measure passed. Arizona, it's leaning that way, but on the presidential side, it's definitely not a 63% for Harris versus 37% for Trump.
No, it's not, but I expected a lot of these measures to pass. Remember, in every, since the fall of Roe v. Wade, in every case when abortion rights has been on the ballot, the pro-abortion rights measure side of the equation has passed. That includes some blue states like California, Vermont. It also includes some deep red states like Kansas and Kentucky, where abortion restriction measures failed in recent years. Now, that winning streak has come to an end tonight.
With Florida, right?
Well, not just with Florida, though. So first of all, the supporters of abortion rights in Florida couldn't get to 60%, so that measure goes down to defeat, even though it got 57% of the vote. But let's take a look here at the very bottom. South Dakota, only 25% of the vote in, but it's trailing by a 36% to 64% margin. Measure G is not coming back. I mean, this is going to be the first straight-up majority defeat of an abortion rights measure on the ballot if those results hold, which I expect they will. But there we go. The final point I would make is with all these measures on the ballot, I think there can be some cognitive dissonance, right? How does somebody walk into the ballot box and vote in favor of an abortion rights protection, and then a Republican candidate who, especially say,
well, and I was going to say
President
Trump specifically, because he is the one that enabled that court to exist, that ultimately defeated, or not defeated, but rescinded essentially Roe v. Wade.
Right, and the two theories are in some cases, and I heard this from Democratic strategists, they worried that having this measure on the ballot would create a permission structure for people to walk into the polling place and say, well, I'm protecting abortion rights, and now I can vote for the Republicans who I would typically want to vote for.
Oh, that's an interesting thought.
And the other theory as to why this would pass when Republicans seem to be doing well, at least at the presidential level in Arizona, we'll say, I mean, still a close race, no calls yet, anything like that. But the other part of this is voters don't like rights being taken away. And I think this is why we see things like gun control measures failing at the ballot box. Abortion is the Democratic corollary, right? You don't want those rights taken away. You're going to vote to protect them.
All right, thanks. We've taken some time now focusing on these other storylines that are very state level, but now we want to turn to it's county level, but it's presidential. We've been doing some more analysis on some of those bellwether counties that we were talking about last time, and at this point, what Harris's campaign should be concerned about. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, let's start with Wisconsin. And the theme that we're going to be talking about here is, I think, a theme that not a lot of people saw coming at the beginning of tonight. Sure, we've seen plenty of evidence over the last 5-6 years that Republicans are getting more and more juice out of small rural counties. We know that. That's been a factor, and that has been a factor tonight in a lot of the results that we've seen. What we haven't seen, or I suppose what we expected to see, was Democrats getting more and more of the vote out of larger urban centers, urban cores, the biggest cities in America.
Well, and that's also standard for them as well.
Correct. That's not what's happening. In fact, Donald Trump is improving on his margins, or at least Vice President Harris is falling short of President Biden's margins in some of the most important counties for Democrats in these districts. So let's start. Let's start with Dane County. That's it, Madison right here. You can see that Vice President Harris 74 to 24. 4 years ago, Biden carried Dane County 75 to 23. Let's flip over to Milwaukee, the other big vote center here. You can see Vice President Harris taking 2/3 of the vote there. Let's see, Joe Biden took. Oh, actually, that's. Sorry, so I'm looking at the wrong column here. Biden scored 69% of the vote there. So again, Harris coming up a couple of points short. The more important thing is that Trump has improved from 29 in 2020 to 31% in Milwaukee County this year.
Interesting.
Go over to Dane County. He was at 23%, now up to 24%. So again, these are marginal differences. These are small differences, but you add them together and you add them to the rural counties that are shifting, and a state like Wisconsin that went for one candidate by 20,000 votes, something like that.
Well, that's what I was about to say, was the narrowest of margins before. So even though they may be small when you do that comparison, they are impactful because of that narrow margin of win from the last election.
Exactly. Let's flip over to Pennsylvania now, where I think the story is, we talk for years and years about how important the voters in the suburbs are, and they determine a lot of elections. But let's go down here and look at Montgomery County. Oh, great! Now the map's not working.
Oh, I can fix that.
Okay, there we go.
Let me take us.
All right.
Yep.
Sounds good. So Montgomery County. Remember, we've been talking about these 4 collar counties outside of Philadelphia. Here we go. Fantastic.
You're welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Of course.
Technological genius over here.
Well,
I'm just going to go
Montgomery County.
Montgomery County, 4 years ago, Biden carried 62% of the vote there. Tonight, Vice President Harris is improving on that number at 65%. Still 40% to count. So lots to go there. But that's an improvement. The place where Harris is falling behind is in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, she's got 77% of the vote. Joe Biden carried 81% of the vote there in 2020. That's a steep fall off for Pennsylvania's most populous county to lose 4 points of ground. It is also the home. Philadelphia is also the most diverse city in Pennsylvania. It is where the Democratic coalition should be holding together. That's not what's happening tonight. Little by little, some non-white minority voters are moving towards President Trump. I can't tell yet if it's a huge movement.
And I was going to say,
but
we
it's
don't
something.
have that data yet. I know there's some exit polling out there where we can kind of extrapolate, but this is one of those.
And
the dust needs to settle. They need to. We've been hearing about the post. What did they say? Postmortem on the election, and really digging into that to see what party did what, where someone maybe failed or didn't get a message quite across. But to your point, we are seeing it in at least the overall numbers that shift.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's just, and again, it's marginal, but marginal matters at a time when one candidate is winning a state by 10, 20, 30,000 votes.
I'm pulling up Erie just because we talked about that the last time. So we've increased to 75%.
And we're close to a neck and neck race there.
Yeah,
so it's a 3-point race, 3.5-point race in favor.
Three and a half. Yep, 3.5. You mathed it so much faster than I mathed it.
I'm supposed to do this. So.
I appreciate that.
Last one. Let's look at Michigan. And in the time we have left here, the story is largely the same, except it's actually even worse in the big city in Wayne County, which is Detroit.
I'm working on it.
That's all right. The map will come up. Everybody can picture Michigan. You know, you got the Upper Peninsula and all that stuff. Wayne.
Oh my gosh, there's people making fun of my graphics out there, and now they're like, "Well, hold on, we're going to show you Michigan by using my hand." No, let me just get the Michigan map up.
Okay,
all right,
sounds
there
good.
you are.
Here we go. Michigan here. We've got Wayne County down here. That's the home of Detroit. You can see that Vice President Harris at 62% of the vote. Joe Biden was at 68% of the vote in Wayne County there. So definite slippage on the Democratic side. Trump improving from 30% 4 years ago to 36% today. Just as importantly, up here in Oakland County, 56-42 for Biden. Now down to 54-44 for Harris. So more slippage there in the bigger county, one of the biggest counties, the biggest county in the state. So again, Republicans are having this rural surge that we all saw coming. This started with Glenn Youngkin the year after President Biden took office. It has now moved into the presidential year. The wrinkle is that it's happening in urban areas too. And if this trend continues through the rest of the night, and this goes in President Trump's way, boy, this is going to set off an earthquake among the Democratic Party, who is watching its urban coalition crumble tonight.
Indeed, and I will say there are ripples for the Republican Party as well, because there have been those discussions of, okay, well, if Trump loses, then the party needs to do its own postmortem, and is his populism-led way of running things really the future for this or not? But if they take it, then that might set that in stone. And with J.D. Vance as the VP, I mean, we might be seeing the next Republican presidential nominee in an executive office as it is. All right, hey, Reed Wilson, thank you so much for joining us for the coverage throughout tonight. I know you got to take off after this, so what a guy. I know you guys can't well, you can applaud at home if you really want, but I'll applaud for you. Now, this whole live stream not yet over, so stick around as we wrap up our coverage here on election night. A lot more to talk about, and we hope you join us for it.
Welcome back to America's Vote 2024. It's almost midnight here on the East Coast, and the final polls on the West Coast are starting to close down. Let's over now to Washington correspondent Hannah Brandt, who's on the ground at Howard University, where Vice President Kamala Harris is holding her election night party. Hannah, what is the vibe there at Howard right now? How are folks feeling? Because this map is not looking great for Kamala Harris.
Hey, Michael. Hey, Drew. Yeah, and we've definitely heard the crowd quiet down just a little bit. As results were rolling in earlier on, we heard a lot of cheering from the crowd every time a state was called for Harris. Now that cheering has sort of died down as less states are being called her way, but of course we're just waiting for the results to roll in those tighter swing states. They're still holding out hope that it's going to go their way. Really, we're just waiting for the vice president to make her appearance here. That could happen at any point now. What she's going to say, though, still kind of in doubt. But what we've heard from the campaign is that they always expected this to be close. So they're saying, hey, don't panic yet. We're waiting for those results to come in, and we're still hoping we can finish strong.
Do we know where the vice president is right now? Where is she watching these returns? And have they given any kind of time frame for, when she might come make an appearance? I imagine, most of those people staying there don't want to stay there all night.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and people are certainly eagerly awaiting her arrival. They want to hear exactly what she has to say directly from the candidate herself. We haven't heard exact timing from the campaign yet, but I can only guess that she'll be here sometime soon. We're nearing midnight here, and certainly they don't want to wait too long. They've got a lot of supporters here. The crowd actually has been growing over the last hour or so as people line up to watch her speak.
And Hannah, back in 2020, we saw a situation where Donald Trump opened up a sizable lead in a number of areas. Kamala Harris chipped away at that in the coming evening and days, and then she ultimately, Joe Biden chipped away at that lead, and then he ultimately took the lead. Are you getting the sense that Harris advisors and campaign staffers are hoping for that same scenario, or confident that same scenario would pan out, or is there a lack of optimism at this moment?
Yeah, certainly the Harris campaign says that they always believed the blue wall would kind of be what it came down to. That's Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And those are critical states for Democrats to win if they want to pull off a victory. So they definitely think there's still hope. They're saying we're not giving up quite yet. And really just waiting for those results to come in. Those were always expected, again, to be close states. And so it's not really all that much of a surprise that they're not called yet.
All right, thank you for all your reporting tonight, Hannah Brandt. And we have a new DDHQ projection. Kamala Harris wins the state of New Jersey. Back with us for the final time tonight is the Hill's editor-in-chief Bob Cusack and national political reporter Julia Manchester. I want to let you both kind of give us what have you learned tonight?
Well, I think the first thing, unless things change, that the pollsters were wrong yet again, underestimating Trump, even though they said, "Oh, we've accounted for it." Well, clearly not. He is overperforming, and there were a lot of races like Rick Scott in Florida. Oh, maybe Democrats can win that race. He won easily, just like Marco Rubio did a couple years ago. So, listen, I think that. A lot of Democrats now, there's the dwindling hope, but also I think they're going through different stages of grief. And the first one is denial.
I think we overestimated the vibes, really. I mean, Kamala Harris, Democrats trying to make this about the vibes election, leaning into pop culture, the excitement seen on social media, on TikTok. But I gotta say, I was pretty skeptical of that from the beginning. I mean, it just goes to show how siloed this country is and how siloed that online really community is. I remember during the DNC, there was a lot of excitement around that. You, of course, have the creators for Kamala, for example, the DNC, and it created, I think, what seems to be, and it's could change. I don't want to say it's final, but a false sense of optimism, a false sense of excitement for Harris.
And Bob, I've spoken to a lot of House Democrats and Democratic lawmakers, strategists in the lead up to this election. You could not get through a conversation with them without them bringing up abortion and women's reproductive rights and optimism that the frustration after the fall of Roe would be what would push them into victories this cycle, as it did in 2020. Does not seem like that was the case. The ballot initiative failed in Florida. We still saw Rick Scott win in Florida, Donald Trump winning that state. Democrats, I think, were banking on the fact that some Democrats would go to the polls and vote for the abortion ballot initiative and vote up and down the ballot Democratic. It doesn't seem like that panned out.
No, it didn't. And listen, and that strategy did work in the midterms of 2022. The red wave didn't happen. Republicans did win the House, but by a narrow margin. We saw how difficult it was running the House. You know that very well, Michael.
Yes.
But this playbook did not seemingly work in 2024. Why? Abortion was a top issue, but also it wasn't the top issue.
Right.
And I also had somebody come up to me recently and say, okay, well, if Democrats win, and I'm not sure how she was going to vote, what can they actually do at the federal level? And as we all know, Harris said, well, if I'm elected president, then I will codify Roe v. Wade. But Trump mentioned this in debate. It's inside baseball. She would have never had the vote. No. She would never had 60 votes. So at the federal level anyway, she really couldn't have done much other than administrative and executive orders, which are not nothing. But as far as overturning Roe v. Wade, that wasn't going to happen anyway.
Right.
And there was a story that came out in the New York Times that I think is along these lines and important to realize. It is the number of abortions since Roe v. Wade was overturned have actually gone up each year.
I saw
so,
that.
it really maybe hasn't been felt in the states. It's angered progressives for sure, and you have these cases of women that are needing care in emergencies that are obviously heartbreaking. but the abortion pills being mailed across state lines. People are traveling to other states. So, as angry as some progressives are, maybe the average voter doesn't feel it impacting their life the way Democrats thought they would.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's obviously, I think, an incredibly personal issue to women and also to men. But look, I think it just goes to show how this is not a black and white issue for voters, that a lot of voters are not single issue voters. I mean, talking to a lot of people in progressive circles and Democratic circles in that base, it seemed that, there was this idea that women in particular, young women, would be single issue voters. And, I think many of them in many cases were, but at the same time, though, I think it's more complicated than that. I think there are also young women, for example, who want to be able to save up and buy a house or invest in that, who might care about crime, for example, or immigration. So I think these issues, it's incredibly complicated. There's a lot of gray area here. I think in the aftermath of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because it was so fresh, you saw that visceral reaction, but 2 years later, it just seems to not be as visceral, at the polls at least.
And Bob, let's talk about the Democratic coalition right here, because Georgia is already a flip this cycle. Donald Trump has won it this year.
Yep.
I'm looking right now at Decision Desk HQ, and Donald Trump currently has a lead in all 3 of the blue wall states. Now, if that remains that way, that's not a blue wall, it's a red wall, A,
Right.
and B, it's a complete 100% flip from 2020. What happened to the Democratic coalition?
Well, listen, I think, Trump has brought new coalitions of people into the Republican Party. This is not a country club Republican Party anymore. David Plouffe, former Obama advisor, Harris advisor now, said earlier today they could win all 7 battlegrounds. Well, Trump has a good shot of winning all 7 battlegrounds. So they really need to look in the mirror and figure out, okay, what is our message other than abortion, because we're not changing the Supreme Court ruling anytime soon. And I also think, listen, inflation affects everybody.
Yeah.
And you don't know, okay, we avoided a recession, but and the rate of inflation went down, but you don't get that money back. And I was talking to Jim Greenwood, who actually said to Harris' campaign, maybe you should have an inflation kind of rebate thing where you get money back. I think that was an interesting idea. The campaign didn't go for it. But listen, I think there will be a lot of second guessing about her message on the economy. And again, how she did not have a clear answer of how she's different than Joe Biden, other than saying, clearly I'm not Joe Biden. That's not an answer. That's ineffective. And people don't like those answers, and they vote with their pocketbooks.
And voters are saying that answer was unacceptable.
Very much so.
She is seeing it at the ballot box.
You talk about Donald Trump bringing in new portions of the population into the Republican camp. If we can pull up Wayne County, this is in Michigan. It's Detroit, which is heavily black. It's Dearborn and Hamtramck, heavily Arab. In 2020, Biden was plus 38 in that district. It's only 17% reporting right now, but Harris is only winning by 26%. So that was one of the big concerns. How is she doing with the black vote, and how is she doing with Arab and Muslim voters who are maybe upset over the war in Gaza?
That's a good point, Drew. I mean, listen, I think that it's always a mistake. We saw this in 2016 where surrogates would say you got to vote for Hillary Clinton if you're a woman, okay? Barack Obama, I think, made a rare misstep in trying to use guilt to get black men to vote for Harris. You don't get people by chastising them. You've got to uplift them. And listen, I think if you look at polling, and we work with the Harvard Harris and Mark Penn, he has been consistently saying, trying to straddle this tightrope of Palestinian activists and people who are in favor of Israel in that conflict. It didn't work. Their numbers are terrible, whether it was Biden or Harris, and the administration was never on the same page with Israel, and that clearly has hurt them.
Julia, there's been so much said this cycle about the trajectory of the Republican Party. Would it continue with this MAGA, America First agenda if Trump won or lost? What happens now? I think that the conversation tomorrow is going to be, what's the trajectory for the Democratic Party? Where do they go from here after seeing their coalition is essentially crumbling right now?
Absolutely, and I mean, just looking at Ohio, for example, Sherrod Brown, an institution, the last statewide Democrat ousted in that state. You know, he was, I think, one of the few Democrats that was able to sort of, and I think he was for a while running ahead of Harris in Ohio, and he's done that before. But he's one of the rare Democrats who have sort of been able to, I mean, easily moderate their message and appeal to Trump voters. I mean, in 2012, for example, Sherrod Brown was talking about China and trade and such. You know, that's no more. I am curious to hear what progressives have to think about this. Are progressives going to be angry at Harris? I know I've been noticing, you know, online some uncommitted activists saying that Harris did not do enough to talk to that community and such. So I think there's going to be a big reckoning. But, you know, in terms of where Republicans go from here, I want to stick with Ohio for a second. I think the role of crypto is huge. Yeah. We know that obviously J.D. Vance from Ohio has a lot of ties to cryptocurrency, but Bernie Moreno in particular, I mean, he was boosted by crypto. So I'm curious to see, just in general, but also with Republicans, how we see this relationship with people like Peter Thiel, crypto really evolve going forward, because it seems to have benefited them.
And just one thing on Ohio, the Wall Street Journal did a great story on Sherrod Brown and how a lot of people vote for Brown and Trump in the past. And they asked Brown, do you know why Trump has basically taken over Ohio and made it a red state? And you know what Brown said? I don't know. Democrats have not figured out why Trump has taken off, and they got to figure that out.
A lot of reflection, a lot more to talk about and analyze in the coming days, weeks, and months of this unprecedented election season. Bob Cusack, Julia Manchester, thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's it for The Hill's election coverage, America's Vote 2024. Thank you for joining us this evening. And make sure to go to thehill.com for the latest election updates. We're going to keep on it, keep pumping out those numbers, and make sure to subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.